Hand over the client list, old man. You're done. The 31-year-old VP sneered. I just nodded and left. What he didn't know was that my departure just triggered a clause that would wipe out 80% of his company's revenue overnight. Let me rewind 15 years. It was 2011 and I was 37. I walked into Apex Global Strategies, a boutique financial advisory firm in downtown Chicago, with a modest book of business and a hungry ambition. At the time, Apex was pulling in a respectable but unexciting $7 million in annual recurring revenue. The founder, Richard, was a cautious man. He liked slow, steady growth. He didn't want to make waves, and he certainly didn't want to take on the massive institutional clients that demanded specialized regulatory compliance. But I saw an opening. Over the next 15 years, I didn't just build a client list. I built a fortress. I focused on ultra-high net worth individuals and Tier 1 institutional investors. These weren't clients you won over with a shiny brochure or a free lunch. These were entities that required rigorous due diligence, customized risk management frameworks, and most importantly, absolute trust. They didn't trust Apex as an abstract entity. They trusted me. By 2026, my 52nd year on this earth, Apex Global Strategies had transformed. The firm was now generating $55 million in ARR. And out of that $55 million, a staggering $45 million sat squarely in my portfolio. I was managing over 80% of the company's revenue stream. My compensation structure was simple and lucrative, a 5% overriding commission on the gross revenue of my book. That meant I was taking home a very comfortable $2.25 million a year, not including performance bonuses. I earned every penny. The level of operational complexity required to service these accounts was staggering. We weren't just managing stocks and bonds. We were navigating complex private equity placements, international tax arbitrage, and multi-generational trust structures. To handle the regulatory requirements for some of my largest institutional clients, specifically a $12 million mega contract with a European sovereign wealth fund, I had to maintain a highly specialized Series 24 principal license and a bespoke fiduciary certification that was registered explicitly to my personal LLC, not to Apex. Richard knew this. He was perfectly happy to let me run my empire within his empire, so long as the checks cleared and the audits came back clean. We had an understanding. I was the rainmaker, the architect, and the custodian of the firm's lifeblood. But Richard was getting old. His health began to fail in late 2025, and by early 2026, he announced he was stepping down from day-to-day operations. He retained his majority shareholder status, but the operational reins were handed over. The board, in a move of staggering nepotism, didn't look outward for a seasoned executive. They didn't look inward at the senior partners who had built the firm. Instead, they handed the title of Executive Vice President of Operations to Richard's 31-year-old nephew. Preston. Preston was a walking cliché of unearned confidence. He had a freshly minted MBA from a mid-tier university, a closet full of aggressively tailored Italian suits, and the kind of arrogant smirk that only comes from never having faced a real consequence in life. He had spent the last 3 years consulting for tech startups that inevitably filed for bankruptcy, but in his mind, he was a disruptive genius, ready to drag our dinosaur firm into the 21st century. From day one, Preston made it clear he didn't like me. I represented everything he wasn't. Experienced, indispensable, and immune to his corporate jargon. He would walk into my office, lean against the doorframe, and talk about synergy, agile restructuring, and maximizing shareholder value. I would just look at him over the top of my reading glasses and ask him if he had reviewed the quarterly compliance reports for the European fund. He never had. Preston's primary obsession, however, wasn't operations or compliance. It was my compensation. He couldn't fathom why a single portfolio manager was making over $2 million a year, while he, the executive VP, was pulling down a mere $400,000. He didn't see the 15 years of 70-hour weeks. He didn't see the late-night conference calls with Tokyo or the grueling due diligence sessions in Geneva. All he saw was a massive line item on the firm's expense sheet. "You're a cost center," he told me during our first one-on-one meeting, tapping his expensive pen on the mahogany desk. A very expensive cost center. We need to look at transitioning your accounts to a team-based management structure. It's more efficient. My clients don't want a team, Preston, I replied evenly. They want the person who built their risk models. They want the person legally accountable for their fiduciary compliance. He waved a hand dismissively. Clients adapt. We're paying you too much for maintaining legacy relationships. The brand brings them in, not you. I almost laughed. The brand? Apex Global Strategies was practically unknown outside of Chicago before I landed my first institutional whale. But I kept my face impassive. If you try to touch the European Fund or the Sinclair Family Trust, you're going to trigger a cascade of regulatory audits that you are entirely unequipped to handle. He narrowed his eyes. Are you threatening the firm? I'm stating a fact, I said, standing up. Review the contracts, Preston. Read the fine print. And don't mistake my patience for weakness. I walked out, leaving him fuming in his overly cologned air. I knew then that the clock was ticking. Preston wasn't just arrogant, he was greedy. And greedy men with unearned power always make the same mistake. They reach for the crown before they understand the weight of the kingdom. I didn't panic. I didn't complain to Richard, who was spending his days on a golf course in Florida, oblivious to the internal shifts in his legacy. Instead, I went back to my office, locked the door, and pulled up the master service agreements for my top 10 clients. I spent the next 3 hours reviewing every clause, every addendum, and every regulatory requirement. I knew exactly what Preston was going to do. He was going to try to fire me, seize my accounts, and absorb my $2.25 million commission into his own divisional budget to make himself look like a financial genius to the board. What he didn't realize was that I had spent the last 15 years structuring the entire division with legal safeguards, and the key was sitting squarely in my pocket. All I had to do was wait for him to hand me the termination letter. The confrontation I had been anticipating finally arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in late October. The financial markets were experiencing a slight correction, which is exactly the kind of environment where my high net worth clients expected proactive, stabilizing communication. I was in the middle of a complex risk assessment for a sovereign wealth fund when my desk phone buzzed. It was Preston's assistant, a nervous young woman who always sounded like she was reading from a script. She informed me that the executive vice president required my presence in the main conference room immediately. I saved my spreadsheets, locked my workstation with my security key, and walked down the hall. The conference room was unnecessarily large, featuring a massive glass table that reflected the gray Chicago skyline. Preston was sitting at the head of the table, flanked by our head of human resources, a woman named Sarah who always looked vaguely apologetic, and a junior associate I barely recognized, presumably brought in to take notes, or perhaps just to witness my downfall. Preston didn't bother offering me a seat. He was holding a sleek tablet, scrolling through what I assumed were my compensation figures. He looked up, his face set in a practiced mask of corporate sternness. "We are restructuring the asset management division," Preston announced, his voice carrying the forced authority of someone who had practiced this speech in the mirror. "The current model is unsustainable. Having a single portfolio manager monopolize $45 million in annual recurring revenue creates an unacceptable concentration of risk for Apex Global Strategies." I remained standing, keeping my posture relaxed. Concentration of risk? The risk models have been stress-tested quarterly. The portfolios are diversified across 6 asset classes and 12 geographic regions. There is no risk concentration. I am talking about key person dependency. Preston corrected, entirely missing the irony of his own statement. The clients are too attached to you personally. That's bad for the brand. We need to institutionalize these relationships. Therefore, effective immediately, your accounts will be redistributed among a newly formed steering committee. He slid a thick folder across the glass table. This is your severance package. It's standard. 6 months of base salary, continuation of health benefits, and a non-compete clause that prevents you from contacting any Apex clients for 24 months. I looked at the folder, but didn't touch it. 6 months of my base salary was negligible. My wealth came from the 5% overriding commission on the gross revenue of my book. By firing me and enforcing a non-compete, Preston was effectively trying to confiscate my $2.25 million annual income and hand it directly to the firm's bottom line, which conveniently would make his quarterly numbers look spectacular to the board of directors. "You're terminating my employment so you can absorb my commission structure," I said plainly, stripping away the corporate jargon. Sarah, the HR director, shifted uncomfortably. "We are eliminating the role of senior portfolio manager to create a more horizontal organizational structure." I ignored her and focused entirely on Preston. "Have you actually reviewed the master service agreements for the Tier 1 clients? The European Fund, the Sinclair Family Trust, the logistics conglomerate?" Preston rolled his eyes. "Yes, I have reviewed the files. They are standard asset management contracts. The clients signed with Apex Global Strategies, not with you personally. The transition will be seamless. Our legal team has already drafted the introduction emails." He hadn't read them, or if he had, he lacked the operational literacy to understand what he was reading. He saw the name Apex Global Strategies on the letterhead and assumed that was the end of the legal reality. He didn't understand the intricate web of fiduciary responsibilities, the specialized licensing requirements, and the explicit termination clauses I had carefully negotiated over the past 15 years. "Security is waiting by your office. They will supervise you while you pack your personal items." "You have 30 minutes, Preston sneered, finally dropping the professional facade. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or threaten litigation. I didn't warn him about the catastrophic mistake he was making. When your opponent is actively detonating an explosive device in his own lap, you don't interrupt him. You just make sure you are standing a safe distance away." "Understood," I said calmly. I didn't touch the severance folder. I simply turned around and walked out of the conference room. The walk back to my office was quiet. True to Preston's word, 2 security guards were standing by my door. They looked embarrassed. I had been at the firm longer than either of them, and I knew their kids' names. I smiled at them, unlocked my door, and began packing. I didn't take any physical files, client lists, or company hardware. I didn't need to. Every crucial piece of information I needed was either stored securely in my eidetic memory or legally housed under my personal LLC secure servers. I packed a few framed photographs, a vintage crystal decanter I had received as a gift from a Swiss banker, and my favorite mechanical keyboard. I placed them neatly in a cardboard box. As I was walking out of the building, the crisp October air hitting my face, my phone buzzed. It was an automated notification from the firm's internal system. My corporate email had been deactivated. My access to the trading terminals was revoked. I was officially locked out of Apex Global Strategies. I walked to my car, placed the box in the trunk, and sat in the driver's seat. I didn't start the engine right away. I took a deep breath, savoring the profound silence. For 15 years, my life had been dictated by the relentless demands of a $55 million firm. Now, I was a free agent, but I wasn't just unemployed. I was a man who held the keys to $45 million of that revenue, and Preston had just forcefully ejected me without asking for the keys. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for my personal corporate attorney, a sharp litigator named Miller, who specialized in high-stakes contract law. "Miller," I said when he answered. "It happened." "He actually did it?" Miller asked, sounding a mix of amused and incredulous. "The nephew fired you? Just now. 6 months severance and a standard non-compete." Miller chuckled. "Did he mention the keyman clauses?" "He told me he reviewed the contracts and that they were standard agreements. He has no idea." "Beautiful," Miller said. "Absolute, unadulterated hubris. Shall we begin the sequence?" "Yes," I replied, starting my car. "Execute at phase 1. Let's see how long it takes for the house of cards to collapse." I drove home, poured myself a glass of 18-year-old scotch, and prepared to watch the fireworks. The countdown had officially begun, and Preston was entirely unaware that the bomb ticking beneath his chair was wired directly to the legal framework of his most valuable assets. Phase 1 was elegant in its simplicity. Over the years, as my client base shifted from moderately wealthy local businessmen to massive international entities, the legal requirements to manage their funds had escalated exponentially. You can't just move $12 million for a European sovereign wealth fund without proving you possess the strict fiduciary licensing required by their regulatory bodies. When we initially signed that European fund back in 2021, Apex Global Strategies didn't have the specific Tier 3 regulatory clearances in place. It would have taken the firm 18 months and hundreds of thousands of dollars in compliance audits to get them. I, however, already held those clearances personally through my independent consulting LLC, a remnant of my early career days that I kept active. To secure the $12 million mega contract, Richard and I had drawn up a specialized sub-advisory agreement. Legally, the European fund contracted with my LLC, which then white-labeled the operational execution back to Apex. My LLC held the sole operating license. Apex provided the back-office support. It was a brilliant, highly profitable symbiosis. The most critical component of this arrangement, however, was the keyman clause. Embedded deeply in the European Fund's master service agreement, and subsequently mirrored in the contracts of my other top-tier clients like the Sinclair Family Trust, was a very specific stipulation based on the principles of the restatement, second, of Contract Section TEL 261, regarding the impracticability of performance. The clause stated unequivocally that if I, the specified keyman, was removed from the account, fired, or ceased to provide direct advisory services, the client possessed the absolute right to terminate the contract immediately, without penalty, and withdraw all funds within 48 hours. Furthermore, because my LLC held the actual regulatory licenses for the international transactions, Apex Global Strategies was legally barred from executing a single trade on those accounts the moment I was no longer an employee. Preston, in his infinite wisdom, hadn't read past the first page of the contracts. He saw the Apex logo at the top and assumed ownership. At 9 o'clock the morning after my termination, Miller sent out the first wave of certified letters and encrypted emails. These weren't emotional pleas or angry demands. They were cold, legally binding notifications of material breach. The letters informed the European Fund, the Sinclair Trust, and 8 other major clients that I had been involuntarily terminated by Apex Global Strategies, thus triggering the keyman clause. The letters also formally notified Apex's compliance department that my personal LLC was revoking the sub-advisory licenses, rendering Apex legally incapable of managing those specific portfolios. I spent that Wednesday morning on my back patio, drinking coffee and watching the leaves fall. My phone remained silent. I had left my corporate device on Preston's desk, and my personal number was known only to my clients and my attorney. By 11 o'clock, Miller called. The European Fund just filed their notice of immediate termination with Apex, Miller said, the satisfaction evident in his voice. $12 million in ARR, gone. They are pulling their entire portfolio. Did they cite the keyman clause? I asked, taking a sip of coffee. Explicitly. They also filed a regulatory freeze on all current trades being processed by Apex, citing the revocation of your LLC's license. Apex is legally paralyzed on that account. If Preston tries to move a single penny, he'll be committing securities fraud. What about the Sinclair Trust? The Sinclairs are furious. They just sent a demand letter to Apex requesting an immediate transfer of all assets to a holding account. That's another $8 million in ARR walking out the door. In less than 3 hours, $20 million of Apex's $55 million revenue stream had vaporized. The financial impact was catastrophic, but the operational impact was even worse. When a Tier 1 client pulls a portfolio of that size, it triggers a massive liquidity crisis. Apex would have to liquidate assets, untangle complex investments, and execute massive capital transfers, all while legally barred from using the very licenses required to do so. I could picture the scene at the Apex office. Preston was likely sitting in his corner suite, expecting a quiet day of absorbing my accounts and patting himself on the back. Instead, his compliance department would be sprinting down the hallway, waving red flag termination notices and screaming about regulatory freezes. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the cascade accelerated. 4 more clients, representing an additional $15 million in revenue, activated their keyman clauses. The non-compete Preston had so proudly handed me was completely irrelevant. I wasn't soliciting these clients. They were terminating Apex based on a pre-existing contractual trigger that Preston himself had pulled. "We are at 35 million, Miller updated me later that afternoon. Apex's total revenue is now effectively $20 million. They are bleeding out." "Have we heard from Preston?" I asked. "Not a word. His legal team is probably running around like decapitated chickens trying to figure out how to stop the hemorrhaging, but there is nothing they can do. The contracts are ironclad. The licenses are yours. They are locked out of their own house." I smiled. The arrogance of the new executive VP was about to collide violently with the reality of high-stakes corporate law. He had wanted my clients. He had wanted my commission. Instead, he had just bankrupted his uncle's legacy in under 24 hours. The chaos at Apex Global Strategies wasn't a slow burn. It was an instantaneous flashover. By Thursday morning, less than 48 hours after I had packed my mechanical keyboard and walked out the door, the firm was in a state of absolute operational paralysis. When $45 million in annual recurring revenue abruptly exercises immediate withdrawal clauses, it doesn't just affect the balance sheet. It destroys the firm's liquidity ratios. The clearinghouses, noticing the massive outbound transfer requests, immediately flagged Apex's accounts for review. This meant that even the remaining $10 million of the firm's revenue was temporarily frozen. Apex couldn't execute trades, they couldn't process payroll, and they couldn't even pay their electrical bill. My personal phone finally rang at 10:15 a.m. It wasn't Preston. It was Sarah, the perpetually apologetic head of human resources. "Hello, Sarah," I answered, keeping my tone perfectly pleasant. "We need you to come back," she blurted out, bypassing any pleasantries. Her voice was shaking, carrying a frantic edge I had never heard from her before. "Right now, we need you to come into the office." "Sarah, I am no longer an employee of Apex Global Strategies," I reminded her gently. Preston was very clear on that point. "I have my severance folder right here. I haven't signed it yet, but the termination was effective immediately. Please," she begged. "The European Fund just filed a complaint with the regulatory board because we can't process their asset transfer. Our compliance officers are threatening to walk out because they are terrified of personal liability. Preston is not handling this well." I could only imagine. The disruptive genius with the MBA was suddenly faced with actual tangible consequences. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but without my personal LLC's licenses, Apex cannot legally touch those accounts. And since I am no longer employed there, I cannot authorize the use of my licenses." "What do you want?" A new voice snapped over the line. It was Preston. He must have snatched the phone from Sarah. He didn't sound arrogant anymore. He sounded desperate, cornered, and furious. "What is your game here? Are you trying to destroy this company?" "I'm not doing anything, Preston," I replied smoothly. "I am simply abiding by the terms of my termination. You fired me. The clients, exercising their legal rights under the contracts you claim to have reviewed, decided to leave. That's not a game. That's a consequence. You engineered this," he yelled, the panic bleeding through his anger. "You set this trap. You purposefully hid those clauses." "The keyman clauses are on page 4 of every major master service agreement," I corrected him. "They are highlighted in bold. The licensing structure is detailed in the quarterly compliance reports, which you told me you didn't need to read because I was just a legacy cost center. You didn't do your due diligence, Preston. You aimed for the king, and you shot yourself in the foot." There was a long, heavy silence on the line. I could hear him breathing heavily. The reality of his situation was finally crushing the last remnants of his ego. He had wiped out 80% of his company's revenue, paralyzed the remaining 20%, and was staring down the barrel of massive regulatory fines. And he had done it all within his first month as executive vice president. "How do we fix this?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the hollow tone of a man who realized his career was over before it had even begun. "We don't fix this," I said. "I fix this. But not with you. Put Richard on the phone." "Richard is in Florida. He's retired. He doesn't." "Get him on a plane," I interrupted, my voice dropping its pleasant facade, replacing it with the cold, hard authority I used to negotiate multi-million-dollar deals. "I am not negotiating with a 31-year-old child who plays dress-up in Italian suits. You have 24 hours to get the founder of this company in front of me, or I let the regulatory board tear Apex down to the studs. I hung up. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in corporate panic. Miller forwarded me the frantic emails from Apex's legal team. They were offering everything from reinstating my position with a massive bonus to begging for a temporary licensing bridge to process the transfers. Miller, following my instructions, simply replied with a single sentence, stating that we were awaiting a meeting with the majority shareholder. On Friday morning, I walked into the conference room at Miller's law firm. Sitting across the polished mahogany table was Richard. He looked older, tired, and deeply unhappy to be back in Chicago. Beside him sat Preston, looking like a whipped dog. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, and his tie was loose. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone. "You've made your point," Richard said heavily, rubbing his temples. Preston made a catastrophic error in judgment. He acted without board approval, and he clearly did not understand the operational architecture of your division. "He acted out of greed, Richard," I said, taking a seat. "He wanted my $2 million commission. He thought he could just take it." Preston opened his mouth to defend himself, but Richard shot him a look so venomous, the younger man physically shrank back into his chair. "Preston has been removed from his position as executive vice president," Richard announced, his voice flat. "He is no longer affiliated with Apex Global Strategies in any operational capacity. Now, tell me what it takes to stop the bleeding and get the clients to rescind their termination notices." "The clients aren't rescinding anything, Richard," I said, leaning forward. "They are done with Apex. They don't trust the firm anymore. They trust me." Richard's face fell. He knew I was right. In the world of ultra-high net worth wealth management, trust is a fragile commodity. Once it's broken, it cannot be glued back together. "Then what are we negotiating?" Richard asked, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "If the clients are gone, the firm is dead. We have $10 million in ARR left, and we are functionally paralyzed." "I am offering a buyout," I said simply. Richard stared at me. "A buyout? You want to buy Apex?" "No," I corrected. "I don't want Apex. I want the remaining infrastructure. The compliance architecture, the trading platforms, the office leases, and the back-office staff. I already have $45 million in clients waiting to be onboarded to my new firm. I need a turnkey operation to handle them immediately." I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a formal acquisition offer drafted by Miller. "I am offering to acquire the operational assets of Apex Global Strategies for 3 times the valuation of your remaining $10 million revenue stream," I explained. $30 million, paid out over 3 years. It allows you to retire with dignity, Richard. It saves the jobs of the back-office staff, and it prevents the firm from going into bankruptcy. Richard looked at the paper, his hands shaking slightly. He had spent his entire life building this company, only to watch his nephew destroy it in 2 days. $30 million was a fraction of what the firm had been worth a week ago, but it was a lifeline compared to the alternative. "And if I refuse?" Richard asked. "Then on Monday morning, the regulatory board enforces the freeze. Apex defaults on its clearinghouse obligations by Tuesday. By Friday, you file for Chapter 11. You walk away with nothing, and Preston spends the next 5 years dealing with shareholder lawsuits." Richard didn't even look at his nephew. He just pulled a pen from his pocket, stared at the acquisition offer for a long moment, and signed his name. The ink on the acquisition agreement was barely dry before Miller initiated the massive transfer protocols. The transition was breathtaking in its speed and efficiency. Apex Global Strategies as an independent entity effectively ceased to exist. In its place rose a new organization, fully licensed under my LLC, seamlessly absorbing the $45 million in annual recurring revenue that had walked out the door just days prior. I didn't just acquire their clients. I acquired their infrastructure, their compliance frameworks, and the very office space I had been unceremoniously escorted out of. By Monday morning, when I walked back through the glass doors of the downtown Chicago office, the Apex logo on the reception wall had already been removed, replaced by the sleek, minimalist branding of my new firm. The security guards, who had watched me pack my desk 5 days earlier, now held the door open for me, looking profoundly relieved that their paychecks were no longer frozen. I greeted them by name, walked past the reception desk, and headed straight for the corner suite, the one Preston had occupied for exactly 3 weeks. It was empty, save for a lingering scent of expensive cologne. I instructed maintenance to completely clear the room, replace the mahogany desk with a standing workstation, and strip out the pretentious decor. I didn't want any ghosts of arrogance lingering in my new headquarters. As for Preston, his downfall was absolute. Richard, furious at the near destruction of his legacy, didn't just fire his nephew. He ensured the board pursued aggressive clawbacks on Preston's signing bonus and any compensation he had received during his brief tenure. The irony was poetic. Preston had tried to confiscate my $2.25 million commission to pad his own pockets. Instead, he found himself facing a mountain of legal bills, his reputation in the financial sector entirely radioactive. Word travels fast in Chicago, and nobody wants to hire an executive whose first decision triggers a massive liquidity crisis. Richard retired to Florida as he had always intended, though his retirement was funded by the $30 million buyout rather than the massive ongoing dividends he had expected. It was a fraction of what he could have had if he had simply left well enough alone, but it was enough to keep him comfortable. We occasionally exchanged brief, polite emails regarding the final buyout installments, but our relationship had fundamentally changed. He was no longer the founder, he was merely a creditor. The European Sovereign Wealth Fund and the Sinclair Family Trust were thrilled with the outcome. They hadn't wanted to leave in the first place. They just hadn't wanted to be managed by a firm that didn't hold the proper licenses or respect the intricate fiduciary frameworks we had built. When I explained the situation to the board of directors in Geneva and the Sinclair family patriarch, they were remarkably understanding. They valued competence above all else, and I had just demonstrated an operational ruthlessness that assured them their money was in very capable hands. By the end of the first quarter of 2027, my new firm wasn't just stable, it was thriving. Unburdened by Apex's conservative growth models and Preston's idiotic attempts at restructuring, I was free to expand. I promoted the best of the back-office staff, implemented new algorithmic risk models, and secured 2 new Tier 1 institutional clients, pushing our total annual recurring revenue past the $60 million mark. My compensation, previously capped at that 5% commission structure, was now tied directly to the equity of the firm I owned outright. I was no longer an employee, no longer a legacy cost center. I was the architect, the custodian, and the sole proprietor of a financial fortress. Occasionally, usually late on a Friday evening when the trading floors were quiet and the office was empty, I would sit at my standing desk and look out over the Chicago skyline. I would think back to that rainy Tuesday morning, to the arrogant smirks on Preston's face, as he handed me a severance folder and told me to hand over my clients. He had thought he was playing corporate chess, moving pieces on a board he barely understood. He thought firing me was a power move, a quick way to consolidate control and artificially inflate his own value. He had completely failed to understand that I wasn't just a piece on the board. I was the one who had built the board, wired the legal safeguards into the foundation, and held the only key to the vault. When you spend 15 years building an empire for someone else, you learn exactly where the structural weaknesses are. You learn which load-bearing walls cannot be moved and which licenses are legally indispensable. And if someone is foolish enough to try and evict you from the house you built, you don't fight them in the hallway. You just step outside, lock the door, and let them realize they don't have the keys. The transition from employee to owner hadn't been planned, at least not initially. I would have been perfectly content to continue managing my book of business and collecting my commission under the Apex umbrella. But Preston's greed had forced my hand. He had wanted to teach me a lesson about corporate hierarchy and institutional power. Instead, he received a masterclass in contract law, fiduciary responsibility, and the absolute, devastating power of the key man clause. He learned that in the world of high finance, true power doesn't come from a title, an expensive suit, or a nepotistic appointment. True power comes from holding the licenses, maintaining the trust of the clients, and knowing exactly what is written in the fine print. He handed me a termination letter, thinking it was the end of my career. He didn't realize it was just the deed to his uncle's company, wrapped in a severance package. And all I had to do was nod, pack my desk, and let him detonate his own career.